Hello, and welcome. Tonight's story takes us back to the late 1970s, a time when hope, idealism, and social change shaped the lives of many Americans. But deep in the jungles of South America, a community built on promises of equality and faith would become the site of one of the most shocking tragedies in modern history. It happened in November of 1978. In a remote settlement called Jonestown, located in the small nation of Guyana. More than 900 people would lose their lives in a single day. Slow breath, how did a religious movement dedicated to unity and justice end in catastrophe? And how did an isolated community become the setting for one of the most haunting chapters in modern history? This is the story of Jonestown. Background and context. To understand Jonestown, we must begin years earlier in the United States. The story centers on Jim Jones, a charismatic preacher who founded the People's Temple in the 1950s. At first, the organization attracted followers because of its message. Jones spoke about racial equality. He promoted social justice. His church welcomed people of all backgrounds during a time when many communities were still deeply divided. For many followers, the People's Temple represented hope. Families joined. Friendships formed. Members worked together on social programs and community outreach. Over time, however, the structure of the group began to change. Jones became increasingly controlling. Critics and former members began speaking publicly about manipulation, financial pressure, and strict loyalty demands. As scrutiny increased in the United States, Jones proposed a solution. He would move his followers to a remote agricultural settlement in South America, a place where they could build a new society free from outside influence. That settlement became Jonestown. Located deep within the jungles of Guyana, Jonestown was meant to be a self-sufficient community. Members farmed crops. They lived in shared housing. They worked long hours building what they believed was a new beginning. But the isolation also meant something else. Limited communication with the outside world. And increasing control by one man. The incident by 1978, concerns about the People's Temple had grown. Former members spoke with journalists. Families worried about loved ones living in Jonestown. That concern eventually reached the United States government. In November 1978, Leo Ryan traveled to Guyana to investigate the situation. He was accompanied by journalists, government staff, and several concerned relatives. When the delegation arrived at Jonestown, the community initially appeared calm. Residents greeted visitors. They showed the buildings and farmland. But during the visit, some members quietly approached the delegation. They asked for help leaving. They wanted to return to the United States. The group prepared to depart the next day, with several temple members who had chosen to leave. But events quickly escalated. As the delegation traveled to a nearby airstrip called Port Katuma Airstrip, armed individuals associated with the temple arrived. Gunfire erupted. Congressman Leo Ryan and several others were killed. It was a shocking act of violence that signaled the crisis unfolding back at Jonestown. Later that same day, within the settlement itself, tragedy spread across the community. Hundreds of people died in what became known as the Jonestown Massacre. By the time authorities arrived, the scale of the disaster was almost unimaginable. More than 900 people had died. Among them were hundreds of children. Investigation news of the tragedy spread quickly across the world. Authorities from both United States and Guyana began investigating what had happened. Military personnel were sent to recover victims and document the scene. Investigators examined recordings, documents, and testimonies from survivors. They found audio recordings made during the final hours of the community. Those recordings suggested that Jim Jones addressed the settlement and spoke about what he called a final act of protest. Survivors described a tense atmosphere. Some individuals appeared to follow instructions under intense pressure. Others tried to escape into the jungle. Several people did manage to survive by hiding or fleeing before the tragedy reached them. Investigators concluded that the deaths were the result of a coordinated event directed by Jim Jones. Jones himself was found dead at the scene. Trial, aftermath, because the primary leader had died. No central criminal trial took place for the events at Jonestown itself. However, investigations continued into individuals connected to the attack on the congressional delegation. The tragedy triggered national and international debate. Questions were raised about cult dynamics, religious freedom, and government oversight. Media coverage was intense. For many Americans, the story was almost impossible to comprehend. How could such a large group of people end up isolated in the jungle? How could a movement built on ideals of equality collapse so completely? The events of Jonestown became a turning point in how society discusses high control groups and charismatic leadership. Unresolved questions even decades later, Jonestown continues to raise difficult questions. How did so many people place such complete trust in one leader? What psychological and social forces allowed the situation to escalate so dramatically? Could earlier warnings have prevented the tragedy? Historians and researchers continue studying the events. Some focus on the early ideals of the People's Temple. Others examine the warning signs that emerged as the group became more isolated. One truth remains clear. Jonestown was not a single moment. It was a long process, shaped by trust, control, isolation, and fear. Understanding that process is essential if similar tragedies are to be prevented in the future. Outro: the story of Jonestown is often remembered for the scale of the tragedy. But behind every number was a person. A parent. A child. A friend. People who believed they were building a better life. Their stories remind us how powerful leadership, community, and belief can be both for good and for harm. Pause if this story encouraged you to learn more about history and the complexities of human behavior. You're welcome to subscribe for more thoughtful true crime and historical documentaries. And if you choose to share your thoughts, please do so respectfully. Because the events of Jonestown are not just history. They are a reminder of the responsibility we all share to ask questions, to stay aware, and to protect one another. Slow breath. Thank you for listening.